And I'll just say a few words as we get started here. Again, thank you for joining us. We had this contribution agreement in place since calendar year 2019, which is our fiscal year 2020. Many of you probably remember the great in-person meetings we had. We had one up north, one down south, where we had all of our district forester partners and our NRCS district conservationists and other planners and leaders together. We went over this brand new contribution agreement. If you recall, that was right before COVID. That was actually one of the last meetings that we had in person, at least within NRCS. So it has a lot of fond memories. Those of you who may have come on since that time, this may be brand new to you. That's again why we want to highlight the agreement that we have in place and the expectations of each of our partnerships, so we can, as Jerry mentioned, service our joint clients to the best of our abilities and get that resource conservation on the ground. Thank you, Dan. I'm glad to see you. You've got the presentation now. Technology's working for us. Appreciate it. You're kind of the one-man show here. Sorry for making you do that, but I will do my best to try to get back onto the computer. All right. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive right in. If you're not familiar with Teams, there are just a couple of housekeeping items that we want to make sure everyone's aware of. Please, we want this to be interactive, and you can do so by either unmuting yourself, and you can see there the little microphone. I believe everyone's figured out how to turn that on and off. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. You can also raise your hand. There's a little person there with a little hand. If you hit that, Dan will be able to monitor that and see that you have your hand raised. We will do our best to stop periodically and call out you for your questions. And finally, you can enter a question in the chat, which is the little, it looks like a little cartoon call out thing there. You can type your question in there and we will monitor the chat periodically and make sure that we answer any questions you have. Okay. All right. So let's dive right in. Next slide, please, Dan. Just want to give a brief update to make sure, again, we're all on the same page and we understand how important this partnership is and how we work together to bring outstanding conservation to our forest landowners here in Indiana and the impacts that we're having. Next slide, Dan. So I'm speaking primarily to our forestry partners. Through this contribution agreement, we are dealing primarily with two key programs, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. As we know, we also work together on Conservation Reserve Program, but that is not covered in this agreement, so we're going to focus on these two programs here. Next slide, Dan. And just to show the contribution of our joint efforts. Next slide, Dan, I'm sorry. It's not slide, moving on mine. There we go. Thank you. Here's our history of forestry spending in our programs over time. And as you can see, we have done an outstanding job in the past 5+ years of really getting good Farm Bill program funding to our forest landowners. And again, that's a combination of joint efforts between NRCS outreach, DNR outreach, and our private consultants, understanding our programs, understanding the need out there across our forest landscape, and getting our forest landowners excited about managing the forest, and then using our programs to help them get that done. Next slide, Dan. And those same numbers broken down by forest practice. And we're primarily talking 4 key practices, those being invasive species control or brush management, forest stand improvement, forest management planning, and tree and shrub establishment. And you can see that by far the largest portion of our funding does go to treating invasive species. Again, we've gotten the word out to our landowners, working with other partners, with SICM and other key partners, and making landowners aware of the need and the benefit of treating invasive species. And then again, putting that program funding and technical assistance to that. But in addition, we do a lot of forest stand improvement as well through these programs. And so we're getting a lot of great conservation done together. Next slide, Dan. And here's that same data kind of broken down. And we are kind of on a typical average annual budget cycle. This is about what we spend. Again, the majority of that goes to invasive species control. A good chunk goes to forest stand improvement, and then the rest is divvied up amongst other important forest management practices. Next slide, Dan. Just a little bit of detail. So again, speaking primarily to our forestry partners, so that you kind of have a better understanding of how your work impacts our joint clients. Just a couple key things. I want to remind all of us that our programs are continuous sign-up programs. We do have certain dates and deadlines to make sure that we get the funds obligated and paid out in a timely fashion according to Congress's requirements, but we do accept applications any day, year-round. So the key message here is if we have a forest landowner who is interested in doing some good conservation on their land, the first step they should do is go to the USDA Service Center and submit an application. It doesn't matter if the deadline was yesterday. It doesn't matter if the deadline's 300 days away. If we have their application on file, the agency is committed to analyzing that application and that plan and seeing how it ranks out in the next funding cycle. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions on that concept. That's a really key one.
There's nothing in the chat at this time, Shannon.
All right, good. We'll move on then. If you have any questions, again, enter them in chat, raise your hand. We'll try to pause frequently. It's also important to remember to know that we are on a federal fiscal year, which runs from October 1 to September 30th of every year. It's, you all as our state partners know what your fiscal year is. Ours is different, but our funding kind of matches up with the fiscal year. So it's important to know that. Typically here in Indiana, we have an application deadline around December. Okay, now I want to make sure we're clear on that. We have a continuous sign-up programs, but we have an application deadline. And pretty much what that means is if we have an application on file at the local office by that date, NRCS is committed to that individual to rank and assess and analyze that application for funding during this current fiscal or funding cycle. So again, our application deadline, let's say it was December 15th, 2021. But if there was a farmer that came into our office back in February of 2021, we have that application on file, and we now include it in this current funding cycle, and we'll analyze it there. So it's really important to make sure we get those applications on a continuous basis, and so we have them on file. We then, as you're familiar, we rank our applications. We try to fund the ones with the most resource benefit compared to the cost. And then we will obligate those funds to those selected contracts, and then that's when the client can start their practices. Typically, final decisions on funding are, let's just say, get it in your head that they're around September. That's so we get funding, sometimes more funding than our initial allocation, and so we may make decisions up through September. That's about when work is expected to start on these contracted practices. So again, if you can get that in your mind, that most of the obligations happen, several months after the application deadline, and then work starts in the fall following that application deadline. Okay, next slide, Dan. Here's just a typical workflow, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but again, the forest landowner applies for the program at the local office. We then go through a planning process, and of course, with our forest landowners, we rely heavily on our partners with the Division of Forestry, our private consultants, our TSPs, technical service providers, to get a forest management plan, and that's what we base that program application off of. Again, NRCS goes through a planning process. We have to go through eligibility. Sometimes we work with farmers on that, especially our forest landowners who may not be typical USDA participants, and then we rank it, and then we notify that landowner of if they rank high enough to be offered a contract. Then we have to get the details. For the funded practices, we have to get the details to the client. How much basal area specifically to remove, which crop trees to leave, which cull trees to take out, which species to treat for invasives, what's the typical recommended method, the details of how to get the work done. Then the landowner takes that information, and they can either do that work themselves, or they hire a contractor, they install the practice, and then we verify that the practice met our standards, or that the work met our standards, and then we process payment. So again, it's a pretty detailed process, but again, where each of our partners fits into this and where NRCS is fully responsible, that's kind of what we'll go into in some detail here yet today. Next slide, Dan. Okay, now bringing that's just the typical process. Bringing it back here to our current funding cycle, we do have so our application deadline was back in December 17th. So applications that we had on file, we are now working through those right now. The next important deadline coming up is March 18th, 2022. That is the cutoff for us to analyze all the applications we have on file, rank them out, make decisions on the highest ranked applications, and then offer contracts to those farmers who have applications that rank high enough. Now, what that means for our partnership. March 18th is the deadline where decisions are being made. So we have a lot of work to do, and our CS does, to get an application ready for that analysis. So that's where one of the key things of today is going to be communication. You know, NRCS DC communicating with the district forester, letting everyone know where everything is in the process. If we need something from our partners, the Division of Forestry, work it out locally as far as when you typically might hope to have that information from them, so you have time to get into CART, CD, ProTrax, and all these other things that we have to do to make sure we get that done. Okay. CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, we have not set those deadlines yet. We will communicate those as soon as we can whenever we get those established at the state level. Comments or questions on this before we move on? All right. I mentioned, and just again for everyone's benefit, especially our foresters, that March 18th deadline is the drop dead deadline. We probably need everything for our clients at about 2 or so weeks before that, at a minimum. And again, that's something we're going to expect our local staff to work out locally based on workload and everything else, and just have realistic expectations of when we might expect to get some of this information. But we do analyze those forest management plans and the work that's planned to be done through this thing we call CART, the Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool. And if you need to know more about that, please let me know. We'll get you more details on another day. Next slide, Dan. And with that, let's pause real quick, see if there are any questions on the broad overview and update for Indiana NRCS.
There's nothing listed in the chat currently.
All right, let's move on to the next bit of information. All right, now let's go into the details of our contribution agreement, make sure we are all on the same page. So next slide, Dan. All right, you hopefully have seen this. I guess to our forestry partners, I overlooked that you did not receive this when our employees did. Our employees got this, well, February 15th, whatever day that was. You may have gotten it from Brenda and or Zach, but if not, they'll be getting that to you here real soon. So anyways, we have a joint memorandum signed between Jerry Rayner, our state conservationist, and Jack Seifert, just to communicate a consistent message out there to all of our employees. Next slide, Dan. The key points I want to make on this updated document is that really the only updates we had compared to our 2019 joint memorandum is to bring our forestry planning sheet in line with our current program payment scenarios. Okay, nothing else has changed. So if I say something today that is different than how you interpreted this in the past, rest assured that is not a change, but that's why we're here today, to make sure we're all on the same page and can work as effectively as possible. I have a high energy dog and she's in her high energy time, so hopefully you'll enjoy the craziness that I'm dealing with. And again, this memo just issued kind of the details in the process documents and the forestry planning sheet, so I will cover most of that there. Next slide, Dan. So let's dive into the process. And again, I'm going to stepwise us through this just to make sure we're all on the same page. And again, we can always refer back to this written information jointly. If we have a difference of opinion or difference of understanding, we can work that out together. So first of all, like I mentioned, we are working with our clients that are DNR classified program participants, as well as forest landowners who aren't classified participants. But to get into our programs, the first step is they need to come to the local service center. We've already covered that ad nauseum, so we'll move on. And here's where the decision process comes in, and where we need to make sure we're on the same page. First and foremost, for our conservation programs, EQIP and CSP, the applicant, if they're a forest landowner, needs to have a forest management plan. That is a national policy. So that's where you all come in and helping us get that expertise to these clients. Now, I'm speaking now to our NRCS folks primarily. When we set up this contribution agreement back in 2019, we set in the deliverables for not to have DNR do additional and or brand new forest management planning. This agreement was to assist current forest landowners who have a forest stewardship plan to better navigate our programs and to get the details in those forest stewardship plans that may not be required by the forest stewardship program, but is required by our programs. Okay, so I want to make that clear. I mean, we heard a lot of conversation that, you know, our forestry partners, the district forester partners, are not developing brand new forest management plans. We have other means of doing that, and we'll cover that. Okay, I just want to make that clear. So primarily, the customers that our district foresters are working with us on are typically classified forest participants. And a requirement of classified forest and wildlands program is to have a forest stewardship plan. Okay, so that's kind of where we're targeting our district forester partners on those landowners. And to simplify it, and again, we didn't want our district foresters to have to rewrite plans and add additional details that we may need. And so that's where we came up with the forestry planning sheet. And Dan's going to go into more detail on that here in a little bit. Next slide, Dan. Here's a snapshot of it. So Dan will go into this in more detail, just so we're on the same page. So what we're getting from our district foresters is a stewardship plan from our client, as well as a forestry planning sheet. And that's what we need to navigate our programs moving forward. Next slide, Dan. All right, let me pause there and see if there's any questions on that concept, because that's a really important one. Okay, hearing none, we will move forward. Okay, now after we get that forest stewardship plan from the client and the forestry planning sheet, now in NRCS, we have everything we need to navigate CART, Conservation Desktop, ProTrax, and all the other stuff. Again, DNR foresters, you don't need to be concerned about that, but just know that once we get that information from you, we have additional work to do in our systems to enter all that data into CART and our Conservation Desktop and ProTrax, and then that's what makes for a valid application to be considered for funding. Okay, next slide, Dan. Now, as I mentioned, most of the work that we're getting help with from our district foresters are classified forest and wildlands participants. Taking that forest stewardship plan, getting the additional details from our forestry professionals to navigate our systems. We also may, DNR, you guys are also interested in new clients. And so we may have a forest landowner who comes to our office, signs up for a program. They don't have a forest plan at all, forest stewardship plan, forest management plan, or anything else. We can have that conversation with that client and say, hey, are you interested in participating in the classified program and or getting a forest stewardship plan? If they say, yes, I am, we can direct them to the district forester to see how they might fit into that program. Okay, so there's another option. And if that's the case, if they want to become a participant, they will get a forest stewardship plan. Then the district forester can just complete the forestry planning sheet. And now we have everything we need to run that application through the process. And here's a key part of the communication I want to make sure everyone's aware of. I'm speaking to NRCS folks especially. The DNR district foresters cover multiple counties, many counties, and we know that. They have a heavy workload just like we do. If we have a client come in and they say, I want a forest stewardship plan, and that's my preferred option, we need to be upfront with them and have a communication in conjunction with the district forester about a realistic timeline. Okay, even if we've accepted that application and we're considering for funding, if they want to go with the DNR may not be able to get that plan developed in time for our deadlines, and that's okay. The DNR is not going to drop everything just for our clients if they don't already have a stewardship plan, but that has to be communicated to the client, and the client has to have the same expectations. And if they want to continue to wait on the district forester, that's great. but we can find other options if they so desire to make sure that we kind of get them in the right track. Again, a client coming in the door without any kind of forest plan, the first step we need is a plan. And so we have means of helping that. Comments or questions on that before we move on? Okay, let's go to the next slide, Dan, on to the next option. Okay, so if our forest landowner is not interested in a classified program or obtaining a forest stewardship plan, we can sign them up for a conservation planning activity, 106 forest management plan, and or a design and implementation activity, 165. And so that's again our next option. So again, if timing doesn't work out, we can make sure we get that client a forest management plan if they so desire to choose a variety of options. Again, if they want to wait on DNR, they need to know that expectation and the expected timeline. Otherwise, we can get them funded to get with a technical service provider to get that plan developed that way. If they're not interested in a TSP or DNR, and they have a preferred private consultant, that private consultant can also develop that forest management plan. They do have to meet the same technical criteria as our CPA 106 and DIA 165, but they can do that. We can't pay them for that, but that is an option that the client has as well. Okay, so client has pretty much has four. If they do not have a plan already, they have three options. They can wait on DNR. We can get them in with a technical service provider, or they can hire a private consultant on their own. Let's pause there and see if there's any comments or questions on that. All right. I like it when we have clear and concise guidance. That makes it easy.
Shannon, I'm going to jump in for just a second. There was a question just posted into the chat.
Okay.
Basically says, is a plan required at the time the application is submitted, or can it be submitted by the forester shortly after the application has been submitted?
That's a really good question. We will accept any application at any time, but before we can rank and assess the conservation practices that the private landowner is interested in doing, we need a forest management plan to make them out. So our first step is to get them a forest. They sign an application. Our first step may be to get them a forest management plan. Again, they can either wait and get that from DNR. They can get that developed without any payment from a private consultant, or we can get them in touch with a conservation planning activity. Good question.
And then one other question in the chat, Shannon. It says, what if a forest management plan is over 5 years old? Does another need to be made? And then there's a second part to this. Or what if additional practices would need to be added to an existing plan?
That's another good question. And again, that's where that decision needs to be between you as a I don't know if that was a question from NRCS or from the district forester. That needs to be kind of assessed based on what is needed on the land. If it's an old forest management plan, we need to make sure that we're getting the right practices to address the resource concern. For example, if there were no invasive species identified 5 years ago, is that still the case? The trees are 5 years older. So what's the condition? What's the stocking level? What if things have changed out on the landscape? Then yes, probably the best step is get them an updated forest management plan and make sure we get the right practices chosen to address those resource concerns. Good question. Good question.
And then there was one more maybe point of clarification that came in that needs to be made. And this may be our terminology on what an application is, because it basically says some landowners are told they can't submit an application without a plan.
Okay, well, I think we may need to cover that offline.
Okay.
But again, an application to our program, a valid application, we could get that landowner a conservation planning activity.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So I guess I have to say, if that has been happening, we need to at least accept that application. And again, our best alternative may be to get that client a forest management plan, conservation planning activity.
And I guess with the process, even if they go in to sign up, they can't actually be signed up for practices and approved with a contract to implement practices without that plan in place.
That is true.
Okay.
Do we need to repeat that? Does everyone understand that? And if we think about it from an NRCS side, if the landowner already knows the practices they want to do, what are they basing that off of? So likely they have some sort of a forest management plan, and that's where we can analyze what they currently have to help them make that decision. But if they don't, if they say, well, I just read about forest stand improvement in a magazine and I want to do it, we need to say, okay, we can help you, but you still need a forest management plan first, because we need to know exactly what the condition of your woods is, what the practices are going to be like, what the amount of work looks like. Really good questions.
Yep. And then one last question. It says, if a client is going with DNR to create a plan, are we still creating a EQIP contract for a plan?
No. No, that if the client wants to work with the DNR, we still have their application on file, but we can't process that until we get a forest stewardship plan and planning sheet from the DNR to know the practices to put into the contract. So that would be kind of on hold until we get that plan part. Another good question. Yeah.
All right, that catches us up in the chat.
Wonderful, wonderful. Hey, I am back on Teams, Dan, but I'm going to have you continue to forward until I get everything kind of up and running, if you don't mind. So next slide,
okay,
please. All right, and then again, from our NRCS perspective, I'm just going to remind you that we did put this flow chart out. And again, there's a lot of lines coming and going. And as I have talked, you kind of can probably understand that there are a lot of options for forest landowners to get the requirements they need to run through our programs. And I think that the key message here is make sure the client is aware of all their options. And if they choose option A, B, C, or D, just help them understand the reality of those decisions. So again, if they want to choose DNR and DNR realistic says I can't get to you till next calendar year, that's perfectly fine, so long as the client's okay with that, and they'll get that information then, and then we can run them through our programs when they get that plan. If they want to speed that up, they can go to a technical service provider and get paid for that, and then all that other good stuff. There are options. We just need to make sure our clients are fully aware of all the options available to them. Okay. And if DNR folks, if you haven't seen this, we can make sure you get a copy of this. Again, we try to navigate the variety of options for getting a forest management plan if our client currently does not have one. Next slide, Dan. Okay. So I mentioned we've talked about the importance of forest management plan options to get those to our clients. So we have a good solid forest management plan, forestry planning sheet from our client and our forester, and we run it through CART and Conservation Desktop and ProTrax, and we offer that farmer a contract, and so that's where we are. Again, this is all on NRCS. So district foresters, you did your heavy lifting. You can take a break from that part of the work, get on to other work while NRCS does this part. But once we do get that contract in place, now it's time for that client to work and get the practices on the ground, get them installed. So next slide, Dan. Okay, so now we have a funded contract. We're committed to paying that client to install the practices that we agreed on based on the forest management plan and the ranking and everything else. But now the client needs to know more details of how to get that practice installed to meet our standards. We call these implementation requirements. And that's a key part here. And kind of we've heard from a lot of professional foresters that that when they go to do forestry work, they know what they're doing. They're walking around the woods with a chainsaw and herbicide spray, and they're getting the job done as they go. That's great, but our requirements are that our clients need to know exactly what they are getting into, and so that they can get this information to any contractor, and that contractor will know the amount of work that's needed, where it's needed, the methods, all these things. And again, we call that implementation requirements, and Dan will go into a lot more detail of what one of these looks like. Again, just like with forest management plans, clients have a variety of options of getting these developed, okay? Now, we know some of you district foresters, when you develop your forest stewardship plan and planning sheet, you also put together an implementation requirement for your clients. that's great. You know, again, we put this after the contracting step only because it is work. And if that client doesn't get funded, and they won't install the practices unless they're funded, again, that's extra work. But we really appreciate you foresters who are doing this all at one time. That way the farmer does have the how-to instructions. Even if they don't get funded, they can still decide to implement those practices without our Farm Bill program funding. And that's a great thing. Now they know what to do. Okay, so back up. Our clients do have options of getting these implementation requirements. You can see it's through the DNR, private providers, or they can ask us to help with that. So it's next slide, Dan. All right. Hang tight here. Dan, I'm going to try to take over. I'm back up and running. Any comments or questions so far while we're pausing on me to get my machinery working? Okay. Let's move on then. Okay, so some of our clients, you know, they have a well-established relationship with their district forester. They may say, "Hey, I'd like my district forester to help me develop my implementation requirements." And again, just like before, you know, this is not exactly part of our agreement. Let's just be clear on that. We left this out on purpose. But if a client wants to continue working with their district forester to get this next piece of information, the same conversation needs to happen. We need to have realistic expectations. You know, district forester, you know your workload, the time you might be able to get out and get these done. We just need to make sure the client is well aware of that, and so they know all their options. Now, this is kind of where we get into some of our program timelines, deadlines, things like that. Once we have a contract, NRCS, we need to be clear about, hey, you know, if we don't get that implementation requirement by, you know, whatever, September, so that you can do your work in the winter, that's going to push up against our policy, and you may be in violation of the contract. So again, it's a joint communication, realistic expectations, give all that information to the client to let them know, hey, I want to wait, or can I have another option? Okay. But again, if the client wants to work with the district forester, there's information that district forester needs to make sure they get the IR completed correctly and then on time. And you can see that, and we're not going to go into that level of detail here. You can read it at your leisure. Again, well, and also I want to make sure it's clear that, you know, this is kind of the recipe of how to install the practice. We call it the design, the implementation requirement. This does not mean that DNR or NRCS, for that matter, will go out and actually start doing the work. And in addition, DNR policy is you do not mark trees and things like that maybe a private consultant might do. So we have to have realistic expectations from the client of what they expect to get when using DNR as their provider for the implementation requirement. Okay, clients can also choose to have a private provider develop these implementation requirements, and that's great. And they can do that. Again, that would be not with we would not pay for that, but participants can choose a private provider. Or if they say, well, I really want NRCS to help me, and or I want a technical service provider. Again, we have the design and implementation activity 165 that we can get them a payment to hire a TSP to develop those implementation requirements and deliver that to us. And then we can make that payment, and then the client knows exactly what to do to install their practice. Questions on that, Dan?
There are no current or questions in the chat currently.
Okay, great. We will move on, and I am almost done. Then we'll turn it over to Dan's more exciting part. And again, the bottom of that flow chart that we sent out does go into the variety of options that a client can choose to get their implementation requirements done. And again, these implementation requirements can come in with the forest management plan. They can come in after contracting. We can contract practices and then get them into a 165. So, the important part is the client needs these implementation requirements before they install the practice. Because again, if they go out and do the work and hire someone to do the work, but it doesn't meet our standards or it doesn't address the resource concern that was originally identified in the plan, we may not be able to pay them for that. So it's really important that we put all this to that client in writing, so they know exactly what they're what they're supposed to do. Okay, now finally, so I'm going to back up. We got the application. A forest landowner is interested in doing conservation on their woods. We got them a solid forest management plan. We ranked them. They ranked high enough in our system that we obligated a contract for them. We got them the implementation requirements, and now it's time to get the work done. Again, this is up to the client on how they do that, and we're pretty much out of this loop. NRCS and DNR, the client can do the work themselves, or they can hire a contractor. Again, we don't have a TSP list of who is a valid contractor. That's up to the client to choose that. However, part of our agreement, coming back to our agreement, the DNR district foresters are responsible for checking out the practice. So no matter who did the work, no matter who did the forest management plan, district foresters are going out there and verifying that the work meets our standard and address the resource concern. Okay. Again, that's not a change. That's just how we've been. But again, that takes a good communication between the client and NRCS, and then to the district forester. And again, I'm going to say it one more time. District foresters are busy. We need to make sure that communication is clear and concise, that if there's a critical deadline that could put that equip participant in jeopardy of their contract, we need to make sure that's clear, give the district foresters plenty of time to get that work done, and again, have solid expectations of when that might occur. And then we do accept DNR's form, state form 52695, and that's validation or certification that we can issue payment to that client for doing the great work that they got done. Okay, that's all I was going to speak to. Are there any questions?
There was one that just popped up in the chat. Shannon, are you able to see that, or you want me to read that to you?
I can read it. Let me see here. I'll read it out loud. Yesterday, I visited with the landowner who has a classified forest. For our conversation, the landowner stated he's getting some compensation from the state for maintenance. Can this landowner also participate in EQIP for cost share? For instance, a tree planting. I am not. I would have to know more details on what the actual program is that they're participating in, that they're getting. It says state, so I assume that's a state program. I'm not sure what that would be. But so long as there's not another USDA Farm Bill program on those acres, such as Conservation Reserve Program or easement, typically our programs can also come in and do help out with additional work that might be needed. So I can't say 100% yes, but again, for our programs, that's where the client would go into our office, and our district conservationists would work with them to make sure that the land is eligible, that the producer is eligible, so on and so forth. But again, it would be based on that forest management plan that they come in to tell us what kind of work is needed, and then we can work through the eligibility with them. Good question. Good question. That's all the ones I see. Dan, any hands raised?
No, I don't see anything else popping up right now.
Okay, well, great. Hey, if anyone comes up with questions as Dan does his conversation, enter them in the chat, raise your hand. We will do our best to answer them. All right, Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Shannon. Shannon, I also let you know I was not able to grab attendance from this meeting. If you want to try to do that, you can grab that on your end.
Sounds good. I'm back and running now. All it took was a shutdown and reboot.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, great. Well, I will jump into my part of the presentation. My name is Dan Shaver. I am the state forester for NRCS. I'm starting to get comfortable with this position. I've been here just over a year now, and I am far from knowing everything about our practices or programs. So I will try to get you some information today. I guess I do want to just kind of reiterate what Shannon said and stress how important communication is between the district foresters and our NRCS field offices. There's a lot of moving parts in these programs. There's dates that change on a regular basis. Details of our practices change. And so we understand that as district foresters, you guys aren't required to keep up on everything that's going on with NRCS. And so we'll help you understand it and get through the process as best we can. And we appreciate all the technical assistance you provide for us. So I'm going to go over a few things today. I wanted to point out a few resources for the district foresters that may not be aware of where some of this information can be found, and then go through some of the changes to our practices this year. There is, every year we put out a document called the Practice User Guide. It's the second item listed there. I'll go through that in a second, but often our practices get a few changes. It could be related to the rates that we pay for those practices. It can be details about how they're implemented. And I want to show you where that resource is. So I'll jump in with the Field Office Technical Guide. If you're not familiar with this, if you go online and search Field Office Technical Guide, it's going to pull up a screen similar to the one on the right. You go in and select Indiana, hit submit, and then it's going to pull up the 5 sections listed below there. And the 2 sections where most of the forestry information can be found are in section 1. That's where we have a lot of our technical notes. If you're looking for a handout on basal bark application or tree planting specifications, something else to provide to landowners, we have technical notes listed there. And then in section 4, we have a list of all of our conservation practice standards. So if you go into section 4, you can click there and then click on whichever practice you're working on, whether that's brush management or tree and shrub establishment, and it will pull up all of our practice standards and all of the implementation requirements or the job sheets that Shannon mentioned in his presentation. So all of the current documents are found online, and I would strongly encourage you to use the documents that are online. If you have an old tree planting job sheet, you're best to go in and grab a new copy from the Field Office Technical Guide to make sure you have the current version of that job sheet or that implementation requirement. You hear us going back and forth between job sheet and implementation requirement because for years they have been called job sheets and now they've been changed to implementation requirements. So we're all trying to address that. And even some of the documents I put up today will still say job sheet, but we will get those updated to implementation requirement eventually. The other place where you can find a lot of useful information is on the webpage for NRCS. If you search, for example, Equip Indiana, it is going to pull up this internet page and you'll see Equip listed there. But in order to find the practice user guide, which we're going to talk about today in some detail, you need to scroll down all the way to the bottom of that web page. And at the very bottom, you'll see the 2 items listed there on the right that say Indiana Equip payment rates and eligible practices, and then Equip fact sheets. And again, I would encourage you to go check that out. The link there for the 2022 practice user guide, that is where you can find all of the details and specifications on the different practices, the rates and the guidance that we provide to our employees when they're looking at scheduling and implementing those practices. So 2 great places to go for information. I encourage you to go check those out. Now I want to jump into some of the details on some of the practices. Hopefully you're familiar with a lot of these. We do get questions occasionally, and part of the goal of this meeting today is try to clear up some of the confusion between practices and what's needed and required, as well as let you know if there have been updates made in the past year. So to start out with, I just wanted to mention 655 Forest Trails and Landings. This is a practice that is available for landowners in their woods. If they have existing roads or trails that have erosion on them, they can apply for forest trails and landings. This practice is not for creating new roads and trails. So if you have a landowner that has a property and they want to create trails to ride their UTV, this practice is not for them. This is for addressing existing trails that have erosion concerns. And just to let you know that there's no engineering required to plan this practice. That's a misconception I've heard in the past, that this needed an engineering approval from NRCS, and it does not. The district foresters can plan this practice. This is a sample of the planning sheet. Like Shannon said, the planning sheet is going out to everybody, a new updated version of it. The screen capture on the right is the section on forest trails and landings from the planning sheet. And you can see it just includes some very basic information about what the landowner needs in terms of grading and shaping the road or the number of water bars. So you're basically entering in the location of the roads, the linear feet or the number of grading or shaping to be done, or the number of water bars, a rough estimate of the slope on the property, is seeding needed, yes or no, and then the year that they want to implement that practice. You can also see, I'm going to see if I can get my pointer going here. This little bolded section here that says see attached map for locations. It's pretty critical for NRCS. If you're recommending forest trails and landings, that you provide us a map that shows where those roads are. And, you know, if along that road you're suggesting 10 water bars, you may not be able to GPS those exactly where they go, but at least kind of mark in there roughly where you want stuff to be placed. That helps us when we go through our planning process and mapping out practices to be implemented to get the best example of that practice on our maps that we can. And then we talked about the implementation requirements. That planning sheet gets us through the first part of the process. If the landowner gets funded for a contract and they actually need to go out and hire somebody to install water bars and grade and shape that road, we need more detail. And so the implementation requirement, here's a screenshot on the right. You can see it goes into more detail than the planning sheet does, that it includes more information on the location, the grades, the length, the water bar spacing of different segments of those trails. If you're going to do seeding, this is where you'd actually put in the seeding recommendation and rates. There's information on site preparation, planting methods, and how they maintain that practice over time. So like Shannon mentioned, the implementation really gives that landowner the information on how to implement that practice out on their property. Another practice that received a few changes this year is forest stand improvement. This is one of our most popular practices through EQIP. There weren't major changes. We kept the levels the same as last year. So we offer a light level of forest stand improvement and a medium level of forest stand improvement. The rates did go up a little bit from last year. And then we also offer a practice that's called temporary forest openings. With the temporary forest opening practice, we do need a map of where those openings are proposed to be on the landowner's property, because when we create openings, we have to comply with U.S. Fish and Wildlife guidelines for Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat. And so we have to have the state wildlife biologist or myself review the location of those temporary forest openings and make sure they comply with those guidelines. So just keep that in mind if you are recommending temporary forest openings, that we need to have those mapped so that we can see where they're going to be located at. A couple little things that show up oddly in our planning sheet. This on the left is the planning sheet. When you go in, we've tried to make it easy so that you can click on the different levels of stocking and then the level of forest stand improvement that needs to be done. We include on this sheet a heavy level of forest stand improvement. Is the forester, if you're out there and you're recommending more than 40 square feet of basal area be removed, or more than 40 trees per acre released with crop tree release, you can go ahead and schedule that as heavy in the planning sheet. Just know that when our planners look at that, they're going to come over here and we don't have a heavy category for FSI. So we're going to mark it as medium. But again, the planning sheet helps us assess the resource, what's there and what needs to be done. So if you need heavy FSI, put it on there. But just know that they're going to get scheduled for this medium practice if heavy shows up in the planning sheet. A couple samples of the implementation requirement for FSI, and I have a sample of this that I'll put up here in a minute to go over, but it's a little bit more involved. When it comes to the actual implementation of forest stand improvement, we're looking for a little bit more detail on the basal area to be removed by stand, or the trees per acre, or the vines per acre, the date that that's planned, the location of each opening, the acres, total acres of openings, as well as this other information, again, that helps the landowner figure out how to implement this on their property. So the different types of species to be treated, or crop trees to be released, habitat recommendations, additional available resources, and then how they're going to maintain that practice over the next 10 years. Prescribed burning, this is a practice that we in the past have not had listed as eligible under EQIP, under our general funding for EQIP. We added that this year. So if you have forest owners that are interested in doing woodland burns, that can be planned through EQIP. And we actually have a prescribed burning, it's called a DIA 160, a document that a landowner can actually apply for funding to have a prescribed burn plan developed for them. But we get most of our plans from our IDNR district wildlife biologists or our farm bill biologists. So there are probably some district foresters out there that can write burn plans, but many of you aren't interested or don't necessarily have to do that. That is something that we can defer to someone else to develop. Just to let you know, the way we tend to look at prescribed burning, if we get a recommendation for herbaceous cover that needs to be burned, some warm season grass planting or pollinator planting, we tend to refer that to the IDNR wildlife biologists or our farm bill biologists. We have not had much in the way of requests for woodland burns. So for right now, if somebody proposes a woodland burn and you have question about getting a burn plan for that, reach out to me and we will figure out how we're going to get that woodland burn plan developed. We'll deal with that when it happens, but we are encouraging burning in our woodlands, but we just haven't been able to fund it under EQIP in the past, and now we can. And I can pause there for a second, Shannon, if there's any questions that we need to address.
Thanks, Dan. We do have a question from Randy Van Meter. How many trees and shrubs does it take to make a woodland?
That is that's like one of those how much wood can a woodchuck chuck questions. Yeah, so I know classified forest has their own definition of what is considered a woodland for classified forests and wild areas. You know, for us, when we're looking at a woodland, especially when we start talking tree planting and some of those things, if it's not an ag field and it has trees growing on it and it's in permanent cover that is primarily trees, I would say we go with a woodland on that. It doesn't necessarily have to be old trees over your head or, you know, heavily shaded canopy, but if it is a site that is reverting to a forest or primarily growing trees, we would stick it into that woodland category. If you're talking about it in terms of prescribed burning and is it a herbaceous burn or a woodland burn, that probably is a little bit different. If the goal is to kill the woody species out there, then it's probably more of and stimulate the herbaceous plants. We're going to go with our wildlife biologist or farm bill biologist. If it's truly burning in a forest to stimulate the understory or encourage the development of regeneration in that understory, then it's a woodland burn.
Okay, that's all the questions so far, Dan. Thank you.
All right. I'm not going to cover this very much. Shannon hit this really well in his presentation. I did just want to clarify for the district foresters out there that for years you have probably heard us refer to a CAP 106, a CAP 106 as a forest management plan. That has been changed. So now you're going to hear us refer to a CPA 106, which stands for Conservation Planning Activity. And where you may also hear us talk about a DIA 165. That is a design and implementation activity. And those are basically two parts that go together now to make up a forest management plan for a landowner through NRCS. And the easy way to think about that is the CPA 106 is the forest stewardship plan and the planning sheet, and the DIA 165 is those implementation requirements. So it's those two parts that you guys put together. That's also how we're planning now with our technical service providers, or if a landowner or consultant wants to develop their own plan. I listed this, Shannon mentioned this, but when it comes to being paid for developing a forest management plan, through our contribution agreement, there is funding that goes to the DNR for providing that technical assistance and getting us those products. If a TSP is hired to develop a forest, a management plan for us, they get paid directly. If a landowner or a consultant forester wants to prepare their own plan, there is no payment from NRCS for landowner developed or consultant forester developed plans if that consultant is not a TSP and contracted to do so. I'm going to skip this because Shannon pretty much hit this. I will kind of show you guys this slide just so that you're aware of what we're telling our consulting foresters and TSPs. This division of a CPA 106 and DIA 165 could have some advantages, especially if you're working with a landowner with a very large property. Through our new process, they could contract with us to do a CPA 106 on the entire property and kind of get a general overview of what are the resource concerns out on the property, what are the general practices that need to be done to improve that property. And then they could schedule a DIA 165 on just a portion of that property. So maybe the landowner just wants to do invasive species control or forest stand improvement on the areas that were recently harvested, and they want to save the other part of their property for 3, 4, 5 years down the road to do another EQIP contract to do something else. So this new process we have with the CPA 106 and DIA 165 gives us a little bit of flexibility to break up how we plan properties. We could also run into a situation where there is an IDNR stewardship plan on a property and we have the basic details, but we need those implementation requirements and the landowner chooses to work with maybe their consultant that's a TSP. We could sign them up for a DIA 165 just to give us the details that we need from that stewardship plan to implement those practices on the landscape. So that's another way that a landowner might be working with a district forester in classified forest, but they want their consultant to develop the how-to part of the plan, and they can sign up just for that DIA 165 to get the how-to information. All right, we'll jump back into another practice.
Oh, hey, Dan, we have a couple questions if you don't mind.
Yep.
The first one is a statement from Jenny Helt. So she says, something I have seen is forest stand improvement is recommended, then 3 years later, patch openings is recommended. But due to EQIP guidelines of practice lifespan, we cannot do any forest stand improvement for 10 years. Just something to think about on the front end of planning. And again, that's a good point, Jenny. And again, that's where even if the forest management plan comes in with that recommendation, we may have to alter the order of things or how those can be stacked together based on some of our other policies and other restrictions. So again, communication is the key. Just making sure the client's aware, and then the forester who developed the plan would also be aware of that as well. And then Tim Schwipps suggested, he said, will the RCPP Project Young Forest Initiative be available again in the future, or is that RCPP over? And Zach Smith responded that we are looking at renewing our RCPP project. So anything else to add to Young Forest Initiative, RCPP, from anybody? As I understand it, funding is not available this year. Is that correct? Or was this the last year? We might need to look into that, but yeah. To answer, it sounds like the DNR is interested in submitting another RCPP proposal. So hopefully, we got a couple thumbs up on that. So that's probably has been a very popular and very beneficial program, and hopefully we'll be able to get a good application submitted and get some new funding. Funding is not available this year. Thank you. That's why I was confused in my head. But hopefully we'll get funding back for that in the future. And again, that just as I'll add to that, that was a great special initiative. But we still do have that work that is able to be completed through our general EQIP. So hopefully, even without RCPP, we can still get a lot of that great conservation on the ground. Yeah, great. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for that positive statement. The DNR leadership probably appreciates hearing that. Thank you. I know NRCS leadership appreciates hearing that. Appreciate it. Okay, back to you, Dan.
All right, we're going to jump back into tree and shrub establishment 612. This one, we do a whole lot of our tree planting through CRP, but we do some tree planting through EQIP. There are 4 scenarios again this year that can be used for tree planting. There is the traditional bare root hardwood establishment. There is a tree shrub planted area with protection and a tree shrub regeneration area with protection. And again, if you go into the practice user guide, it does a good job of kind of defining what each of those are. But basically the tree shrub planted area with protection, that is a kind of assuming that you have an agricultural field that you are taking out of production, you are building a fence and you are planting trees within that fence. The tree shrub regeneration area with protection is aimed at putting up a fence within a forested area. So you're not building as much of a fence because you're using existing trees in there to fence off that regeneration area, and you're not necessarily planting stock in there with the tree shrub regeneration area with protection. If you want to put up a fence and plant trees within a forested area, there are some options to do that, and you can build a fence. We're currently working on some new guidance for tree planting with tree tubes or some other type of protection besides fences. We've had some recommendations and people wondering how that fits in with the practice. So we'll be working on a technical note to get information out on using tree tubes or tree protectors within a forested setting when you're doing your tree planting. And then we do still have an option for containerized trees, but that's primarily limited to forested openings to supplement natural regeneration. And let's see, I think on the next slide, here's a snapshot from our practice user guide. Again, there's a lot of good information in this practice user guide. I haven't really gone through this yet, but when you go in and look at it, it lets you know what the current practices are and the payment rate for, this is the EQIP user guide. So for EQIP, what the payment's going to be. It lets you know which of our funding scenarios are available to use this practice. So this is where if you weren't sure if Young Forest Initiative was eligible, if it was eligible this year, it would have been listed in here as Young Forest RCPP to know that this practice was available for that RCPP. And then we spell out the planning requirements down here, go into detail on some of the scenarios and what's needed for the different scenarios for tree planting. When you look at the planning sheet, again, the section on the right is just a little picture from the planning sheet. Again, there's not enough detail in the planning sheet for the how to plant the trees. It is really just letting us know that the purpose for doing it, the current land use and acres, the type of planting stock that you think they're going to use, is fencing needed, yes or no, is site preparation needed, and then what is their post-planting weed control going to be needed. It just gives us enough information to get through our planning process, but it doesn't give us all the details that implementation requirement would. And here's a snapshot of the implementation requirement for tree and shrub planting. This pretty much looks like a tree planting plan. It goes into details with the species, the number of those species that you're recommending for that planting, substitute species that you might use if they're not available, hits on the soils type and drainage, and then it goes into, you can see at the bottom, all the different things, the site prep, how it's going to be planted, and then the post-planting maintenance and weed control. So again, just kind of trying to tease out that difference between the planning sheet gives us the basic information to get through our planning process, and the implementation requirement lets the landowner know how to actually do that activity once they have a contract and they're ready to start implementing the practice. Brush management. There's been a few changes to brush management this year, so we wanted to make sure you guys are aware of the differences for brush management, as it is a very popular practice through EQIP. Last year we had 3 scenarios. We had a heavy, medium, and light scenario for brush management. This year they added a very heavy scenario to the mix, and that very heavy scenario is aimed at areas that have greater than 60% cover of invasive shrubs or vines that are greater than 6 feet tall. So it's really looking at those sites where you're getting into a situation where you're almost going to have to use some sort of mechanical means to control those shrubs. It's not just going in and spraying over the top with a backpack sprayer or a UTV with a sprayer. It's going to take some either equipment or mechanical means to get those shrubs knocked back and treated. So we did create this very heavy category for this year. We're still planning for 3 years of decreasing infestation level, just like you have in the past. And we've updated the planning sheet to match that. The one thing that's a little bit confusing when you look at our practice user guide, just based on the scenarios that we had available to choose from to fund this type of work, if you look at this, there is a light scenario, a medium scenario, then a very heavy brush management, and then this removal of woody understory, very heavy. Kind of think of it in terms of what I have in big red letters here. This is light, medium, heavy, and very heavy. We picked two of the very heavy scenarios just based on the cost and what the practice described doing. We felt like this very heavy brush management scenario fit Indiana better than the heavy removal of woody invasive understory heavy scenario that was also available. So we may have added a little bit of confusion here, but from a financial standpoint and the practicality of implementing this on the landscape, we had to go with that very heavy brush management scenario. But when you think about the planning sheet, or as the district forester, you don't necessarily have to worry about the difference. Just think about it in decreasing infestation levels, and that very heavy scenario is just for 60% cover, greater than 60% cover, and vines and shrubs over 6 feet tall. This is the planning sheet, just a snapshot of it again. A couple things that we did. We added a few species to the list up here that you can check. And we added some information here that we're expanding the species that can be treated with brush management. And I'll go into more of that in a second. But I do want to let you know that with the new planning sheet, we updated the pre-treatment and post-treatment levels, and then that sequence for treatment. So the very heavy will now show up in the new planning sheet, so that if you need to schedule very heavy, heavy, and medium, you can do that on the planning sheet. We also put in a little comment here that if you're recommending a skip year in the sequence, of course, you can type that in up here in the year sequence, but you can also check that just so the kind of help our planners recognize that it's not a normal 3 years in a row that you are recommending skipping a year if you feel that that's appropriate to allow species to regenerate or sprout and then get them treated again. Again, just wanted to let you know in our practice user guide, you get more of a breakdown of what these different payment scenarios are and the percent cover that's supposed to be out there, so that as you're out on the landscape looking at landowners' properties, you can kind of understand where it fits based on percent cover. I do want to point out that with the addition of this very heavy scenario for brush management, is that we don't anticipate a lot of properties coming in that recommend very heavy, and moderate or medium across the entire property. We recognize that there are some properties that might fit that bill with shrubs greater than 60% and greater than 6 feet tall across the entire property. But most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, there are sections of that property that have a lighter infestation level. So I would strongly encourage you, as you're out looking for invasive species, doing plots or colored pencils in your vest with a map, that you kind of draw on there where the different infestation levels exist on the property and plan it accordingly. So it's okay for you to submit a map back to NRCS that's broken up by different infestation levels and how they're going to be treated over that 3-year period. I will tell you, with this example here today, if a forester would have gone out and just said, I don't want to map out the very heavy infestations, I'm just going to call it heavy, medium, and light across the whole property, that would have resulted in $19,000 less for this landowner over the course of 3 years to deal with their invasive species problem. By breaking out the areas that truly needed that very heavy treatment, it provides them the financial resources they need to truly address what's happening out on the landscape, and comes in line more with our program and our attempts to kind of hit about 75% of the cost of doing that work. So this is, I think, something, I know it takes a little bit more time to map something out, but again, colored pencils and a map in your vest or using your GPS, if you can break that out by infestation level, it's going to be a lot better for us implementing it, as well as for the landowner trying to get this work done at a reasonable cost. And then one last slide on brush management, just to let you know that we have that list on the planning sheet of all those different species that it can be treated with 314. We did add privet, European black alder, and Norway maple to the list of kind of our priority species this year. For one reason or another, they had been left off in the past, and we wanted to make sure they are included. And then we've also added this line in yellow that says that Any other woody shrubs or trees and vines on the biology tech note number 9, which we will get sent out to district foresters as well, that are identified in the plan can be included in the percent cover calculation and treated with this practice. And so it's really one of those when this biology tech note number 9 pulls together all of the woody shrubs and vines listed in the Indiana terrestrial plant rule, as well as additional species defined by NRCS that maybe aren't on the terrestrial plant rule. So with EQIP, you can treat calorie pear, even though it's not on the terrestrial plant rule. There's some other species in the past that were on the terrestrial plant rule, like bamboo, that could not be treated with EQIP. But now if you have an infestation of bamboo on the property, you can map that out and treat that with very heavy, medium, or very heavy, and medium if you choose to. And you can kind of think of it as a bit of a game. If you can find one of these priority species on the property, then you can treat any one of these other species listed on the terrestrial plant rule list under woody vines or woody trees and shrubs or vines. One example I know that exists out there today is that we had somebody map out an infestation of Japanese hops on a property. Last year, that could not have been treated with EQIP. This year, since we've expanded the list of species that can be treated, if there's just one other little multiflora rose or autumn olive out on that property with those Japanese hops, you can map out those Japanese hops and include it with 314 brush management, and we can deal with that invasive species. And this is really a step we feel like we need to take, because in order to get ahead of invasive species, we've got to start treating those species that aren't just scattered all across the landscape. So if we can find those individual pockets of bamboo or knotweed or Japanese hops that we can get treated early, we have a much better chance of success in controlling them over time versus some of our species that we can treat and we know it helps the resource and it helps the forest, but we know they're not going away. So a little extra incentive to get out and treat some of these other species this year. And that was all I had on the presentation. I can answer a couple questions, Shannon, and then if you want me to go through an actual implementation requirement, I have one of those that I can share as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, we had quite a few questions come in.
Okay.
Michael, I'll get to yours last, and we'll stay on the brush management topic here, and then we'll come back and hit Michael Brennan's question. So Jason Waterman asks, can brush management be used for native shrubs like spice bush, or is it only for non-native invasives?
It is non-native invasive species is what we're targeting. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Shannon, but we haven't used it in the past for native species like spice bush.
Correct. And just to go down that same path, that could be more of our standard. Forest stand improvement would be more in line with removing competition, native competition, if you will. We target our brush management toward our non-native invasives. Yeah, good question. Okay, and Sarah Vaughn has a question. Currently, all of the forest management plans she has only have greater than 50% of invasives control because that was the previous level cutoffs. Last year, that's what it was. Can we justify scheduling the very heavy based off this if the landowner is planning on needing equipment? And I can answer that, Dan, if you want.
Okay, sure.
That might be one of those, Sarah, and others that we may need to update what's currently going on out there on the land. Again, that's where hopefully communication either with the forester who developed that plan and or ourselves, we can go out and make those measurements as well and decide. And again, if we justify that, there are parts of those stands or parts of that woods that are greater than 60% and shrubs and vines greater than 6 feet tall, then we can schedule very heavy there. So again, that might be one of those where the plan is outdated if we do feel that higher payment is justified. But I guess the point there being we need some level of measurement to justify what's in our user guide to verify that payment scenario. Hopefully that answers that question. Then Tim Schwipps asks, so anything over 40% and less than 6 feet tall invasive is called very heavy at $240 per acre rate.
It is, but on the planning sheet, that would show up in that heavy category because that's just how we tend to think of it in those decreasing levels of infestation. But yeah, so you could have an area that has 80% of low growing invasive species and you would still play in that heavy category to treat that the one you mentioned there, the $240 an acre.
Thank you. And then Amanda Smith asks, what about areas that are more than 6 feet tall, but are less than 50% coverage?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to what Shannon says, is that we have those different payment scenarios to cover the different situations we run into out on the landscape. If you are, as the forester and that technical person, if you've got a pocket of an area that you really feel like is going to need some additional work due to the type of invasive plants are there, we value your guys' technical opinion to schedule that and use those scenarios appropriately. So I don't know if that danced around that, Shannon, or if you have a better answer there.
Well, let's be realistic. Again, we did draw lines in the sand. Mm-hmm. However, when you are estimating percent coverage, we know it's not an exact science, right? So, we need some level of documentation that the measurements are actually cross that line that we drew. I'm not saying lie. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm just saying if you think it's justified that, this part of the woods is going to take a lot of work, and the only way to really get that work done accurately and adequately is to use that higher payment rate. Again, you use your professional expertise and document that we do meet those lines. So.
And we've definitely all seen those properties where there are scattered very big, over 6 feet tall shrubs on a property. And as the consulting forester or person doing the work, you're going to have to go through and backpack and then come back through with a chainsaw or something and cut down those big major offenders. And that's not necessarily crossing that line of needing that very heavy payment, but it just requires a little extra work.
Okay, good. And Katie Fagan asks or says, if available, shape files for the location of heavy, medium, light coverage is super helpful. NRCS can pull this information into our planning program, and it saves a ton of time. And that's a statement that is very true. And again, that's where, however we can work best with our forester's expertise and feeding that into our system, that again, our joint client is the one who will benefit. So anything we can do to help each other on that endeavor is going to help. And again, I'll just add to that, again, delineating these out, like, Dan showed that map that had the very heavy, that level of detail. That then just goes to help that client and the contractor work out the proper payment, the proper amount of work. And we do hear from some of our contractors that they get into a woods, and if those estimates aren't accurate, they're losing money. That's, if it is a lot of work, we need to make sure our contractors are still interested to help our clients treat these invasives, and because we need them still offering those services to the best of our ability. So our programs can't adequately reimburse them so long as we have that good, accurate estimate. So good point, Katie. All right, I'm going to go back up to Michael Brennan's question, Dan. That's not related to brush management at this point. Michael Brennan asks, and this is back on forest openings. So again, shift your mind to help that one. Is there a minimum acreage requirement before planning a forested opening? Would 5 forested acres be a large enough area?
There is something within the. Yes, you could plan an opening on a small property like that. It still has to be verified, and I think the U.S. Fish and Wildlife guidelines say there has to be can't exceed 30% of the forested area. So with a small property like that, it does get a little bit tricky. You got to make sure you stay under 30% of that 5 acres when you do an opening. And it still has to meet all the other criteria for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. There has to be a certain number of forested acres within a defined area, and there has to be buffers between other openings. So there are some other criteria that have to be met, but you can do openings on small properties.
Just to add to that, for everyone, Michael, again, typically we would have a forest management plan that would recommend that forest opening. And that's, again, if a professional forester thinks it's suitable, that's outstanding. But then, like Dan mentioned, maybe some of our programmatic and environmental compliance restrictions may have to come in and say, we can't do that with our programs. But again, that's where we can make sure the two mesh together. And then Dan Lee Schnell and Tim Schwipps give a thumbs up to it. Says, thank you for that clarification, Dan. So you said something great. Yep. Appreciate it.
Nice.
Everything you say is great, but there's something in particular. Appreciate that positive feedback, Lee and Tim.
Yep. I did want to point out real quick, I'm sharing right now the new forestry planning sheet that's out there. You can see it does have a date on it, updated January of 2022. I would strongly encourage all of you to go in and delete the old versions of this planning sheet and make sure you have the current updated January 2022 version. NRCS should have that in their hands. I think it came out with the bulletin and it should be getting to DNR soon. But just to make it easier for everybody, if you delete those old copies and go with this new version, it's just going to make that communication a little bit easier.
Okay, Dan, that's all the chat we have so far. No hands raised. So,
okay, there's one other. I wanted to pull up real quick, share one more document with everybody. Hang on just a second. We've got a few minutes left, so we're open to take some general questions. I did just want to real quickly show everybody an implementation requirement. Some people may not be familiar with those as a district forester if you haven't used these before. Again, we're encouraging this for that portion of the process where we need the details of how to implement it. You don't necessarily have to use an implementation requirement, but if you use the ones that we've prefabricated, it makes sure it gets us all the information we need and it hits all the topics that we want landowners to have information on. So I just put up a quick example for forest stand improvement. You can see it goes through basic landowner information, the purpose for doing the forest stand improvement, and then it gives you a narrative section where you can kind of put in the specific recommendations, why you're doing forest stand improvement, the composition of the canopy, the situation with vines on the property. It does include a table that you can go in, and if you did a detailed inventory, you can fill out more information. But again, at the minimum, we need to kind of know how many square feet of basal area are being removed with the forest stand improvement, or the number of grapevines that are out there per acre. That helps us determine that funding level, whether it's going to be a light or medium level of forest stand improvement. We should know that from the planning sheet ahead of time, but it gives us more details. For the temporary forest openings, again, going in and putting in how many and where you're going to put those openings. Then it goes into some more check boxes and text areas where you can provide more information on how to do that forest stand improvement. Are they girdling stuff, doing cut stump, basal bark? How are they actually going to implement the practice? You get everybody dizzy here scrolling, but some additional specifications and details of that work. Again, this is making sure that if the landowner is going to go out and do this by themselves, that they've got enough information to make the decisions on which trees to girdle or which trees to cut within that opening and treat. And then some sort of map to go along with that, so they know where they're doing the different types of forest stand improvement on the property. And it doesn't have to be a super detailed map. Like we said, if things are digitized and you have the GPS coordinates for those polygons, it makes it a little bit easier for us. But for that landowner, they really just need to know where at on the property, or for that consultant forester that's going to be handed this to go out and implement this work, that they know where you wanted that opening at or where you wanted them to do crop tree release. And that's the key to these implementation requirements, is just giving us the how to implement the practice. And then there is a little signature box at the bottom for you to sign, but I just wanted to share that real quick in case you hadn't really seen what a job sheet or implementation requirement looked like. So with that, we're almost right at 4 o'clock. I guess if there's any other questions, we could take them real quick, or we can be done whenever we get done with questions.
All right, great job, Dan. Dan Loziski just popped something in the chat that says this is what you are expecting to see for the design and implementation activity 165 portion of the plan. So yeah, that's very true, Dan. That that's one of the key deliverables of that activity compared to the Forest Management Plan 106. So again, we're still navigating those changes, as Dan Shaver mentioned, but we'll see if we can get the best products to our clients and ourselves to help our forest landowners. Okay, like Dan mentioned, we are at 4 o'clock. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interaction. That makes it very nice to have these conversations rather than just speaking to a blank space. Much appreciated. As with everything, as Dan mentioned, and we'll reiterate this, communication is key. If by chance there's something not quite working or something doesn't fit perfectly in what we gave you, raise that to DNR leadership, raise that to state or NRCS leadership at the area and state office level. We'll work together to find the best solution. As communication, just keep that nice and strong, keep that nice and frequent, and we will do our best to help our joint clients and see the great resource protection we get out of it. So with that, appreciate your time and keep questions coming, and we will look forward to seeing all the great accomplishments you get done together. Thanks a bunch, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.